as the Honourable Attorney General's address last night. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, Your Excellency the President, I believe you'll be listening in on the proceedings of this Honourable House this morning. May I address my chiefs in the vernacular, Mr. Speaker, sir? Unisana Turambale, Marambale. Honourable Prime Minister, Honourable Cabinet and Assistant Ministers, Honourable Members, ladies and gentlemen, young people of Fiji, today I thank Almighty God, Creator of the universe, and Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and the Holy Spirit for granting me life and good health to be able to deliver this main opposition response to the COVID-19 response budget as tabled last night by the Honourable and Learned Attorney General and Minister for the Economy. I have the distinct honour, Mr. Speaker, sir, to deliver the first opposition response as part of our responsibility of defending the rights of the people who have voted us into these chambers. Before I continue, Mr. Speaker, sir, may I congratulate my friend, the newest Honourable Member of the House, who took his oath of allegiance and of office yesterday. Welcome, Mr. Coyer. Mr. Speaker, sir, as we continue this debate, 5 members of the Sodalpa Party listening in. 2 are in advised isolation, having been overseas or been in contact with someone who's recently returned from overseas, Honourable Asir Ndondo, Honourable Lewere. The Honourable Saukuru is in Lotoka, has not been able to get out. The Honourable Dr. Ratuatunyola Malabu is up confined to bed with ordinary flu in Taboni. And the Honourable Whip, who is still in police custody undergoing investigations. I also would like to acknowledge and salute the dedicated health workers, the doctors and the nurses, the orderlies, the ambulance drivers, and all who are directly or indirectly involved in the mammoth task before them in association with the risk of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, sir, I also thank the members of the disciplined services, law enforcement agencies who work day and night to ensure the safety of the people and the country. This time in Fiji and the world has been quite accurately and internationally regarded as a universal crisis time, as the whole world is affected actually or psychologically, definitely economically, by COVID-19 pandemic brought about by the breakout of coronavirus from Wuhan, China in December of 2019. Thus the figure 19 as part of the the brand name given to it, COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, sir, I agree with the sentiments expressed by the Honorable Learned Attorney General and Minister for the Economy in saying that we are living in extraordinary times, and extraordinary measures must be put in place to cushion the impact of our current adversity. In the face of this adversity, we must all stand united. It is time for us to reflect, and it's time for us to take stock as individuals, as families, as communities, and as a nation. We must be united and be steadfast. Our political differences and personal agenda must be placed at the back burner for the common good. As national leaders and legislators, we must work together and reassure our people that we are united as one people. We must instill confidence in our people rather than instilling fear and panic as experienced in the last week or two due to poor dissemination of vital information to our citizens and bad use of the social media. As leader of the opposition, I renewed my call for bipartisan approach to the Honorable Prime Minister in addressing this pandemic through a letter that was sent by email on the 21st of March. I believe he has seen that letter. Perhaps it's too late now for us to go through the process of bipartisan discussion before the presentation of the budget yesterday. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is not the first time that our nation is facing adversity of this degree. But we have always overcome such events through our national resilience, the resilience of our people, and through unity. As highlighted by the Attorney General, the Honorable Attorney General, we must learn from history. We must learn from our experiences in facing adversity. Some of the crises we've come across in the past, and he mentioned it yesterday, the measles epidemic of 1875, we've gone through World War I, 1918 Spanish flu the world went through, we went through World War II, we went through the period of communist revolution and the expansionism policies of the communists in Asia. We've been participating in the Middle East conflict as peacekeepers. We've gone through a period of AIDS, sharks, natural disasters such as Hurricane Bibi and the most recent, the severe tropical cyclone Winston. Now, Mr. Speaker, sir, COVID-19. In all these, Mr. Speaker, sir, I believe Fiji as a colony, Fiji as a nation, with its people, have played a very important part. Perhaps, as the Honorable Prime Minister has repeatedly said, we have punched above our weight in those crises. At this time, however, Mr. Speaker, sir, this has come as a pandemic. So each nation is facing its own epidemic. And I believe that we can ask the international community if we can be relieved of some of the international duties we have been performing on behalf of the international communities to come back and fix our own in Fiji. Most of our military personnel, particularly the leaders, train for crisis. and operate in crises. Sadly, only a few learn to plan for peace while in crisis. We tend to rely a lot on government handouts and pensions when our uniforms are gone, our youthful exuberance is gone, and become old soldiers. But this is such a time, Mr. Speaker, sir, when we can all bring some of them back, the retired doctors, perhaps, those who served in the military, those who are professional doctors in the Ministry of Health and have retired. I believe some of them may be on the list to be called back to help, retired nurses. What do we do now, Mr. Speaker, sir? I believe we have sadly gone past great opportunities of learning. Perhaps we have learned that we have not learned. A lot of those things that we have gone through in the past should have put us in good stead as we prepare for any unknowns in our future. Despite early warning from the international communities, experiences from other countries, we, I believe, delayed our preemptive measures. We could have prevented the pandemic reaching our shores by closing our borders earlier. Just like other Pacific countries, despite the fact that their economies are much smaller than ours, much more vulnerable than ours. I made a number of suggestions in the past asking government to take the necessary steps to reduce those risks. The Speaker, sir, on the 29th of January, I called on the government to put in place stricter controls on entry into Fiji, including requiring passengers to present medical reports, clearing them 4 days prior to travel, and establishment of quarantine centers near all ports of entry to check travel history of passengers for the previous 14 days, and for 14 days voluntary quarantine for passengers upon arrival. I was criticized and vilified by the Fiji Sun on the 31st of January, which insisted that government alone should decide on anti-coronavirus measures. I do not dispute that, Mr. Speaker, sir, but I believe we can contribute to the decisions made by government. Since then, I've issued 7 statements, including calling for the ban on travel by ministers and civil servants, and for the ban on cruise ships, which have been implemented. In contrast, Mr. Speaker, sir, government only recommended voluntary 14-day quarantine on the 15th of March. The next day, patient number 1 returned from San Francisco. His employer, Fiji Airways, then did not quarantine him, but instructed him to fly to Auckland and back to Fiji on the 17th of March. He did not fall sick until the 18th of March, sir. And the Prime Minister announced the presence of COVID-19 in Fiji and the lockdown of Rabuka 7 days ago on the 19th of March. The Minister for the Economy and Public Enterprises must answer for that laxity, because the mandatory quarantine was not announced until the 19th of March. So I believe, Mr. Speaker, sir, the government cannot blame patient number 1 for not quarantining himself when the airline instructed him to fly to Auckland 1 day after his return from San Francisco. Because of the lack of vision and haste, our very own national carrier became the virus carrier. The government should stop putting the blame on others as usual and face the music and take full responsibility for being an accomplice. Mr. Speaker, sir, I would like to reiterate in this august House and to the people of Fiji concerns raised by this side of the House with regard to the manipulation, even abuse of standing orders, which is the guiding principle in the conduct of our affairs in this House. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is sad to note that government is crying urgency to justify ramrodding this thing through, calling it parliamentary processes. If the funding required was so urgent, Mr. Speaker, sir, to combat COVID-19, why couldn't government and the minister responsible for the economy use the funds from the 2019-20 allocated already and already approved by Parliament, and let the parliamentary budget process, as provided for in the standing orders, continue as required by the rules and the principles of good governance and transparency, to let Parliament perform its function to properly scrutinize the proposal from the executive branch.
Order.
Government should not make Parliament a rubber stamp by defeating the rules of Parliament itself. This process is a disservice to the nation, a disservice to the people, and to us, the elected representatives. The legislature must perform its function rather than be railroaded into rubber stamping the proposal from the executive. The suspension of parliamentary rules of procedure yesterday deprived Parliament, the People's House, and the opportunity, deprives the House the opportunity to properly carry out scrutiny in this bill that's before the House. I have doubt, Mr. Speaker, sir, that we all agree that a responsive government, as always claimed by the Minister for the Economy, will take the necessary steps to minimize any real or perceived risk in extraordinary events as we are experiencing today with the announcement of COVID-19 as a pandemic. We must not wait and be reactionary, but we must be proactive. Many books have been written in the past, Mr. Speaker, sir, about planning for these unseen or unforeseen. We say unforeseen, but people have seen them before. I believe they can be intelligently anticipated. Therefore, government must intelligently prepare for them. Are there other options available to government? Take into account that we are only 3 months away from the end of the current financial year. Would it be prudent for the government to make the necessary adjustments within the law in reallocating expenditure to priority areas from the existing budget of the current financial year? Does the government have the necessary fiscal space for the supplementary budget? We have to be very clear in our mind and differentiate the concept behind a supplementary budget and a mini budget. From a layman's perspective, a supplementary budget means an additional expenditure from other sources on additional revenue measures. And we had started raising this even before the last election. I will deliberate on this issue later in my response to the so-called supplementary budget. It is time now, Mr. Speaker, sir, that this august House and the people of Fiji must be told the truth and the reality on the ground. It's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, sir, that the Fiji First government under the Prime Minister Bainimarama has been misleading and deceiving the people of Fiji and manipulating the figures, particularly in this budget, which I will touch on later. The economy and its release is at the whim of the Prime Minister and his Minister for the Economy. Just as the decision to keep our borders open when it was more prudent to have closed them. In the appropriation bill passed by Parliament in July of last year, sir, 1.488 billion was under RIE in different ministries, while 400 was in Head 50. It will be interesting for the Minister for the Economy to inform this august House how much of these funds have been utilized as of today, because the control for the use of these lie squarely under his authority. In reviewing figures in the supplement to the budget, it is worth noting that a fair share of the $1 billion budget increase for COVID-19 is being used for purposes other than COVID-19 activities. How does the increase of 1.5 million for passports improve our response to COVID-19? How does a new item for deportation of 38,000 improve our response to the pandemic? Is it indeed a surprise, Mr. Speaker, sir, to see new expenditure items and increases being sneaked in via the so-called COVID-19 response budget? Another interesting observation under Head 50, Mr. Speaker, sir, is the increase in allocation for vehicle leasing from 20 million in the 2019-20 budget to 29.1 million, almost 50% increase in the supplementary budget, an increase of 9 million, Mr. Speaker. On average, government spends around 18 million annually on vehicle leasing. How practical is this leasing arrangement? And what is the opportunity cost of leasing? Most governments who have trialed leasing have abandoned them. They have abandoned the system because in most cases, leasing has become very costly for them. It is interesting to note, Mr. Speaker, sir, that the Correction Services has been allocated an additional 1.5 million for the purchase of goods and services, rations, and I had 15, Program 2, Activity 2, Seg 5. I note that an increase of 1.7 million has been allocated to the Republic of Fiji military forces on the Head 19, Program 1, Activity 2, Logistics Support Unit, Item 5, for the purchase of goods and services, i.e. warlike stores. I believe there is no direct correlationship between that and an activity in response to COVID-19. Again, in addition, an additional 1.6 million, Mr. Speaker, has been allocated to Program 1, Activity 1 under Item 7 for VAT clearance charges. Again, it is unclear how this allocation is related to COVID-19 response. Is the construction of new police stations a priority in addressing COVID-19? I note that an additional $10 million has been allocated for the construction of the Kasi, Nandi, Nalawa police stations. The Minister of the Economy should at the very least explain the allocation of resources in his speech rather than hiding those non-COVID-19 related activities. It is unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, sir, that I did not have the time to review all heads of the expenditure to identify the variations. I went home at 6 o'clock this morning after trying to read right through both documents, the one we presented to us in the middle of last year and the one presented to us last night. We should have time to thoroughly study and scrutinize the figures given to us by our elected executive. It's very clear that a fair share, Mr. Speaker, of the allocation from COVID-19 response budget is not directly related to the response to the pandemic, but to correct the poor budgeting and planning in the allocation of resources to those institutions. We just have to review the budget in the last 3 years to know the truth. In 2016-17 budget, our total expenditure was estimated to be around $3.6 billion. And estimated revenue was about $3.2 billion. The actual revenue collected was only $2.8 billion. The revenue shortfall was around $338 million. The gap was significant despite the actual expenditure of only $3.06 billion, a shortfall of $583 million. Again, in 2017-18 budget, our estimated expenditure was around $3.4 billion, and our revenue collection was estimated to have been $3.86 billion. The actual revenue collected was only $3.24 billion, a shortfall of $513 million. In 2018-19, Mr. Speaker, sir, our estimated expenditure was around $4.65 billion. Revenue estimate was $4.24 billion, but collection was short by $980 million. The Attorney General will argue that these figures are only estimates, but the concern is the variance between the estimates and the actual. They have always been on the high side. So I believe, due to poor budgeting, the government was forced to reduce expenditure in the 2019-20 budget by $809 million. The reduction of over $809 million in expenditure for the 2019-18 budget clearly suggests that something is wrong, and this is a clear reflection of the poor revenue forecasting and the manipulation of figures in previous years. That reduction confirmed that the Fiji First government is in dire straits, therefore the nation. I'm certain that the actual revenue for 2019-20 financial year will be much lower than what is in the budget estimate, particularly in the sale of assets, despite a reduction of over $809 million. The projected sale of assets, Mr. Speaker, sir, have not been realized in the past. The projected figures have not been realized in the past. The figures have been inflated on the revenue side to show a reduction in deficit, even though it is common knowledge that sales were not executed. The poor forecasting and manipulation of budget figures has the following grave implications. One, Mr. Speaker, sir, growth figures were manipulated to create a rosy picture. These will need to be further revised downwards. Debt level as a percentage of GDP ratio incorrectly dubbed positive GDP growth will increase by almost 10%, which is unsustainable and unacceptable for a small, vulnerable economy like Fiji. Surely with the current trend in our economy, the economy will fall into debt trap. We're already in it. Take into account the slowdown of economic growth with our traditional partners, the percentage of GDP is around 127 million at current price. Government deficit will surely further increase from the estimated 2.7% to around 8 to 10% of GDP. In fact, the document yesterday puts a figure at 9%. There will be a further reduction in government expenditure, which means that the economy will further contract. The reduction in government expenditure will surely affect the current services, which are currently already in a poor and dilapidated state. Infrastructure such as roads, bridges, jetties, and water supplies will continue to deteriorate. And government no longer has the fiscal space to maneuver, as clearly reflected in the International Monetary Fund IMF Article 4 report of February 2019 and the World Bank Weathering Growing Risks report of October 2019. Despite all the indicators, Speaker, sir, and despite all the sound advice from experts that we must manage our economy better and consolidate government finances, the government continues to paint a rosy picture, a false rosy picture, insisting, telling us that everything is okay. It is so sad that independent institutions such as the Reserve Bank of Fiji continue to support government views that the economy is buoyant. Its latest report on the economy now clearly suggests most of the key productive sectors of our economy have not been performing well in the past 5 years. The latest announcement by the Minister for Education in the reduction of education grants to schools and the delay of its payment is clear testimony that government has a cash flow problem. The release of the Fiji Sugar Corporation annual report last week clearly indicated that it made a financial loss of $80 million in 2019 financial year. Today, Mr. Speaker, sir, FSC debt is hovering around $300 million, which will be very difficult to manage, taking into account the current trading environment. The increase in the price of basic food items without any corresponding increase in wages and salaries in the last 5 years is another indication that we are in financial crisis. The increase in revenue measures and fees and charges 2 months after the budget announcement, which reduced expenditure by a whopping $809 million, Mr. Speaker, sir, is a clear sign of desperation. The reduction of $809 million in government expenditure simply means that the economy will contract further by at least $1.6 billion, with a conservative multiplier effect of 0.2, which we really cannot afford at this time. The law and order situation is deteriorating, and the Prime Minister has been given special treatment by the criminal justice institutions, which should be independent in enforcing the law. Instead of everyone being equal under the law, we are seeing the famous, some are more equal than others, being practiced in Fiji. In addition, our debt level is unsustainable in the medium and long term. Today, our debt is around $5.8 billion, Mr. Speaker, sir, increased from $2.6 billion in 2006. It has almost doubled. The economy is in crisis, Mr. Speaker, sir, due to the dictatorial approach taken by the Bainimarama government in implementing the wrong policy mix for the last 13 years, because it is determined by only one individual in the interest of select few rather than the nation as a whole. The lack of consultation with the people of Fiji, particularly the private sector and civil society organizations, has led to the lack of confidence in the economy.
Order.
Despite the claim of buoyant levels of liquidity, commercial banks have increased the interest rate on loan twice in the last 4 months alone. I borrow, I know. These are clear indications that the people of Fiji, in particular investors and the private sector, have lost confidence in the Bainimarama government. Expenditure in the last 3 years continued to surpass revenue, which has led to higher debts. It is unfortunate to note that the government does not have the fiscal space to respond to unexpected and extraordinary events in the short and medium term, despite sound advice given by the experts. The Fiji First government continued its bullish spending without due consideration to our vulnerability as a small island nation. Based on the reality on the ground, Mr. Speaker, sir, in the last 3 years of bullish operating spending for consumption and shortage of revenue collection and poor implementation of government programs, one wonders at the practicality of measures now suggested. The marginalization and removal of key institutions has made it worse and allowed a dictatorial two-man government without checks and balances. Despite all the indications and sound advice from experts that we must manage our economy better and consolidate government finances, the government continues to paint a rosy picture, insisting that everything is still okay. It's sad, Mr. Speaker, sir, that independent institutions like the RBF, as I said, continue to speak favorably of government and their follies. Mr. Speaker, sir, our debt level is unsustainable in the medium and long term. Today it's around 5.8, as I said, 2.6 in 2006. Unacceptable. The reduction in overnight policy rate of 2.25% is perhaps too little, too late. Mr. Speaker, sir, I'd like to just compare page 8 in the document presented to us yesterday and the one presented to us in July. Expenditure in July for this normal current year, $3,840,928,000. For this COVID response budget, $3.536 billion. Revenue, normal budget, $3.491 billion. Now down to $2.507 billion. Gross deficit, $604,436,000, now $1.282 billion. Net deficit as a percent of GDP, now 9%, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, those are not encouraging figures. We agree that we need to take extraordinary measures at this time. After looking through the allocations that they have come up with, I believe too little, too late, and in the wrong areas. Perhaps a redistribution of the normal budget for the year, concentrating it on the areas needed the most rather than the areas we want to please, would be a great move for Fiji. For this crisis, and to prepare for the good times ahead of us. Mr. Speaker, sir, this week and next week, we're going through Lent. We're going to celebrate the Passover feast. Christians and Jews all over the world will be celebrating. It's a time when they remember the angel of death going past every door that was marked with the blood of the Lamb. I believe, sir, that we do this right. We do this right. We will be celebrating soon as the angel of death will go past Fiji. Amen. In crisis, prepare for peace. While you're hunkering down, prepare for the celebration. As you're celebrating, remember, bad times can also come again. Last night, Mr. Speaker, sir, the government made emotional statements that the people of Fiji urgently need a supplementary budget approved. In fact, the urgency is to put paper over, cover over the mismanagement of the economy and of the nation. Not since staff college years, sir, have I stayed up preparing until 6 o'clock the following morning. I've done that. I did that last night. And I'm glad that I'm capable and able to deliver this response, hoping that government will learn from what we contribute in our responses so that the people of Fiji benefit. As I said before, and I say it again, too little, too late. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.